Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first of a series of ballot measure forums hosted by the Council of Neighbors and Organizations. During these webinars, proponents and opponents of the ballot measures will discuss their positions and answer audience questions. Just a little bit about us. The Council of Neighbors and Organizations is dedicated to empowering neighborhoods to improve their communities through education and connection. We help our neighbors connect through neighborhood events. We build resources and leadership of neighborhood organizations. And importantly to this event, we promote and strengthen civic engagement. Tonight, we will address two local ballot issues related to the sale and conveyance of city parkland. We're grateful to have proponents for 2B and Measure 2C with us tonight. Kent Obie will be speaking on behalf of Measure 2B, and Susan Davies will be speaking on behalf of Measure 2C. My name is Richard Strasbaugh, and I'll be moderating on behalf of CONO. Just a quick couple introductions. Susan Davies is Executive Director of the Trails and Open Space Coalition. For 32 years, the Trails and Open Space Coalition has worked to preserve open space and parks and create a network of trails, bikeways, and greenways for the Pikes Peak region. Prior to joining the Trails and Open Space Coalition, in August of 2009, Susan was a reporter and weathercaster at our local KOA TV. And prior to working in Colorado Springs, she was an award-winning television journalist in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Syracuse, and Green Bay, Wisconsin. So welcome, Susan.
Thank you.
Kent Obie is a board member and spokesperson for Protect Our Parks, a park advocacy organization. Kent's a Colorado Springs native who, after a 31-year career in the Foreign Service, has retired back to the Springs. Since then, Kent's been active in land use issues, including community efforts to save the Stratton open space, service on the city's TOPS Working Committee and Parks Advisory Board, and service on the Board of Directors of the Garden of the Gods Foundation and the Trails and Open Space Coalition. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
This is going to be a pretty informal discussion. As we've talked about, you both will have 5 minutes to make an opening statement, and then I'll have an opportunity to ask you questions. And for those of you who are viewing and listening, to ask a question, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and go ahead and type in your question, and then we'll see that and go ahead and ask it. Only the host, me, and presenters will be sharing their screens during this meeting. All your microphones and video cameras will be muted and off. And to ensure a productive meeting for all of us, we ask that there be no disruptions, delays, or other interference with the meeting. This meeting is being recorded, but again, your names, the audience's names, faces will not be seen. So let's get started. Kent, would you like to start us off with kind of a 5-minute statement?
Thank you, Richard, and yes, I would. 2B is the product of actually 5 years of work, and its genesis really goes back to the Broadmoor City land swap in 2016, when, to the surprise of many of us, the city decided to trade nearly 200 acres of North Cheyenne Canyon Park, an area popularly known as Strawberry Fields, to the Broadmoor Hotel for some parcels of land that a number of us felt did not have commensurate value. But that aside, why we're here talking about 2B now is the mechanism by which this happened. That is, it was a land exchange. It was proposed by the city and ultimately approved by the city council in a 6-3 vote. And we began to look at the practice of cities in the rest of the state. And one of the things we found was that Colorado Springs is very much an outlier. In the vast majority of cities and towns in Colorado, the only way you could conduct an exchange like this is by a vote of the electorate. That is, the decision to exchange this land would have to be put on the ballot in an election, and the voters would have to vote. And this is the practice in Denver, Boulder, Arvada, Aurora, what have you. We can go into more detail on that a little later. And a number of us felt that this should be the standard in Colorado Springs too. And the reason we felt this is that parkland is probably the thing that makes this place as special as it is. And it's one of the reasons I moved back here, to enjoy this environment. And our parks and open spaces are how we do that. And the thing about exchanges and trades is they're forever. When you lose parkland, you're not going to get it back. It doesn't work that way. So what we're proposing, and this is what 2B is about, is that any exchange of parkland would be put to the voters. Now, it has in the ballot language also the requirement, as you'll find in 2C, that to refer it to the voters, you have to have a 7-2 supermajority even to put it forward. And we think that's a useful safeguard. And I think means that, you know, you have to jump over a pretty high bar before you even go to an election. But we do feel very strongly that the voters, or the people who own these parks, not the city administration, not the city council, not the parks department, they're all stewards, but the people who own the parks should have the final say if a piece of parkland is being traded away. And that's what 2B is about.
Thanks, Kent. Susan?
Well, thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking you, Richard, Lauren, Stephanie, and all the members of CONO listening in on tonight. I want to thank you for taking the time to care about this. And I'll get into that a little bit later on. That is part of the crux of our concern about 2B. Let me start by saying many of the things that Kent Opie, who I have a great deal of respect for, many of the things that Kent said tonight, I completely agree. You know, our parks are very important to our community. You know, my current career, I spend my waking hours trying to promote our parks, advocate for our parks, trails, and open spaces, and we do that very proudly and do that as well as we can. A few years ago, there was an economic benefits of parks study that was done that found that just how valuable our parks are in terms of dollars and cents, you know, for health reasons, for what they do for the environment, for the fact that when people use their parks, they're healthier and they spend less money on the kinds of things that families have to sometimes if they don't have parks. And we also found that we have people that are ultra users. Our people are in our parks more often than almost any other city in the country. So we know not only are parks important to our organization, parks are incredibly important to our city. The other fact is that we have a very under-resourced parks departments. Our park, when Trust for Public Land does what they call a park score every single year, they find that where we fall down every year, it's not in the acres of parkland or open space or miles of trails. It's how poorly we support our parks. Per capita, the money that we spend in taxes to support our parks is almost always at the low end of the scale. So that forces our park staff to be incredibly resourceful, nimble, and strategic when it comes to not only maintaining our parks, but expanding our parks, which we're always looking to do because we have more and more people moving here all the time, and that will continue to be the trend. In the 10 years that I have been to almost every single Parks Advisory Board meeting, TOPS Working Committee meeting, there have been a number of times when park staff has come to the Parks Board with a proposal for a land exchange. Now, normally these are very small, just an acre here and there that causes a trail to get through someplace, or sometimes it makes sense to take this little piece of parkland and then provide this to a developer. And always, in my experience, the park staff has brought these exchanges to the Parks Board only if they improve the system, only if they got more than what they were exchanging for. When the Broadmoor land exchange came before first of all, a group of community leaders, and then eventually Parks Board. It was an interesting exchange because it changed and changed and changed. And my organization would argue it got better and better and better. And by the end of the actual exchange, pragmatically, all we lost was about 7 acres. The public will have access to the rest of everything that we traded away for perpetuity. But there are 7 acres of that whole exchange now that the Broadmoor can build a small pony stable and a couple of pavilions. But in exchange, we got a portion of the bar trail, the incline, many acres, hundreds of acres of improvement to North Cheyenne Canyon. And one of the most important pieces for us was a much needed extension of the Chamberlain Trail. We didn't have a trail easement through a piece of property that the Broadmoor owned, and now we do. It still wasn't easy. It was very complex. And my organization spent tens of hours looking at that exchange, as did the Parks Advisory Board. There was a public process. It was contentious. At the end of the day, a decision was made that made some people unhappy and others happy. But the complexity of that land exchange is part of the reason that my organization believes it's imperative that we have a supermajority of city council make this call, because they are complex, because we are concerned that the average voter is going to look at this on a ballot and perhaps not put the kind of time necessary into making a decision that's better for the whole system, not just what's good for their neighborhood or their neighborhood park, but we need people to look at it. What does this do for the system as a whole? So for that reason, when one member of council pitched the supermajority, we thought that was a good compromise. Exchanging parkland should never be done quickly, easily. And we are so fortunate that we have amazing volunteers like Kent Opie, who served on the TOPS Working Committee and the Parks Advisory Board, who are apolitical. No, all they're doing and all they strive to do is to make the best decision for the park system and for the community. And from my experience, they do a very good job. And then it goes up the food chain to the city council, where representative government should work. And they too should listen to their constituents, but then at the end of the day, make a decision that's best for the system as a whole. So for that reason, the Trails and Open Space Coalition, and it wasn't, our board was split on this decision, but the majority felt that the supermajority, the 7 members of council deciding, was the best process for the best decision making when it comes to parks and parkland.
Great, thanks, Susan. And what about that, Kent? You know, many say, or, you know, we do elect our representatives based on, you know, our trust in their judgment. They serve and gather expertise and is supported by city staff. Why do we need voters to decide on this directly?
Well, it's interesting because we do have a system of representative government. But at the same time, and I can look at both the national level and even here in Colorado Springs and in Colorado, we've also reserved certain decisions to the voters. And taking the case of Colorado, we have a tax amendment called Tabor, and we specifically say that a tax increase is too important to be left to our elected representatives. And if you're going to increase taxes, you've got to put it before the voters. And we would say the same thing is true of a land exchange or trading away or selling parkland. And the difference is that with a tax increase, you can always rescind it. You can throw the scoundrels out, you can cancel, you can repeal the tax increase. But on a land exchange, when the land is gone, it's gone forever. And when we looked at the practice in the rest of the state, that was clearly the case. Under state statute, and if you're a statutory city as opposed to a home rule city, and 2/3 of our municipalities in Colorado are statutory cities, by state statute, any sale, conveyance, trade of parkland has to go to the voters. And then if you take the home rule cities, which are the larger cities, the vast majority of them, we didn't go down every list, but we spent literally days and days reaching out to other cities. And the vast majority, something like 2/3 to 3/4 of the home rule cities in Colorado, also say that the conveyance of parkland is too important to be left to elected representatives and political whims. And, we looked at even the practice here in Colorado Springs. We feel differently about the Strawberry Fields Exchange than perhaps Susan and her organization does. But there have been other examples. You may remember that back in the Great Recession, 2008, there were proposals by the Board of County Commissioners to sell off some of the county parks to make up for lost revenue. It was proposed, for instance, that Bear Creek Park possibly be sold. And ironically, that same proposal was made by the now council member who is the father of 2C.
So would either of your proposals have prevented a past sale or conveyance of parkland in your view? Is there a case study you can mention? I don't know if Strawberry Fields would have been prevented with, for example, a supermajority and a voter approval ordinance.
Well,
Strawberry Fields, it did pass 7-2, isn't that right? It did pass 7, wasn't that right, Kent?
no, it was 6-3.
It was 6-3. Okay, so that would not have passed.
Although one could argue that there would have been an incredible amount of pressure put on one of those remaining council members, and it would be back in the political field, the political arena, with some of the most powerful economic players here in Colorado Springs. And this is again why we think that something like that ultimately, and fine, let it go to a 7-2 vote on the council, but ultimately the people who own these lands, these parklands, ought to have the final say. And let me just quickly say something in response to Richard's question. We've had examples. We don't have very many examples of exchanges that would have had to go to the voters, but there have been a few. And early on, Susan was talking about minor adjustments to park boundaries and things like that to facilitate a trail or something like that. And we worked very, very closely with the city in crafting the language. This was not language that was put together by a bunch of us working on the outside. As Susan knows, because she was involved in some of the meetings, we sat down over a period of weeks for several months working with city legal staff, city administrative staff, city park staff to come up with language that would provide the kind of protection we were talking about, but would not hamstring the city in making minor adjustments. And if you go back and you look at this very complex ballot language, there are things like a clause that says de minimis adjustments, small adjustments that can be made, but nothing that would equal, say, a several hundred acre transfer of parkland. And the other thing that I think we have to look at in all of this is that these things don't happen very often. Going back in sort of the last quarter of a century, beyond the Strawberry Fields exchange, I think there were two others that might possibly have had to go to a vote. And one had to do with the Garden of the Gods Visitor Center. A minor, and by minor I mean 4 acres, was carved out of the far eastern side of the Garden of the Gods, not any of the red rocks, to reroute 30th Street so that the Garden of the Gods Visitor Center could be built, and largely at the expense of a very generous donor. And I think if that had been put on the ballot, it would have passed. I would have voted for it. And I think most of the people associated with our Protect Our Parks group would feel the same way. The other thing I would say about it is it was not that urgent. And because the donor also had some other other issues that she was working out with the city. I think easily it could have waited to whenever the next city election was to be put forward. In another case, having to do with exchange of land in actually South Cheyenne Canyon, again with the same property owner, there was some land that, if you will, had been occupied by that property owner inside the gate to Seven Falls for many, many years. And a trade was made where some parkland was, if you will, by adverse possession, turned over to that owner. And then the city did pick up some land, the Holly Gully ice climbing area and some acres on the side of Mount Cutler. And again, I think that's something that if it had to go to the voters, it could have easily passed. And I also think that the owner of Seven Falls at that time would have been happy to wait as long as she needed to get it on the ballot.
Susan, do you think, you know, the process that will expand, I don't know if it'll expand in length with just a supermajority only, but will a lengthened process involving voter approval allow the city or force the city to pass on some opportunities that might come along with people not wanting to go through the process and not presenting those opportunities to the city?
That argument has been made. You know, we don't know what we don't know, Richard. You know, we really don't. I mean, we do know that there are plenty of cities that have that law in their books that they will not exchange or sell without a vote of the people. Does that mean that those cities have missed opportunities? Maybe. Kent alluded to the fact that that maybe a land exchange could wait a couple years until the appropriate April so that it doesn't cost $350,000 for a special election. But perhaps an opportunity would come along that we would need to act sooner. And because of the law, have to wait for April, or we would just forego that opportunity because we didn't have the $350,000 in the city budget or in the parks budget, wherever it would have to come from. So there is concern. The other piece is, as Kent wisely said, we haven't had that many exchanges, but there are those that believe that perhaps there could have been some animosity about the person who wanted to make the exchange in Garden of the Gods, and maybe it wouldn't have passed if people didn't understand what we were getting. We just don't know. But what we do know is that at the end of the day, that was an amazing exchange. The Visitor and Nature Center produces dollars that go back into Garden of the Gods to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. How fortunate that we had wise people on the Parks Board at that time, in the park staff, and on City Council that said, well, of course we're going to do this. Why wouldn't we? So there was never any question of someone's prejudice, animosity, anything else. You know, and it's not to say that I don't believe in the goodness of voters. Generally, I do. But I do have concerns that in some cases, things can be skewed, things can be misunderstood. And at the end of the day, that was a very, very important exchange that took place. So I look at this, and my board looks at this as parkland is extremely important. These exchanges should never occur unless they're very, very carefully considered by thoughtful, apolitical people first, and then the best recommendation made, and a very public process. But we truly believe they are so important that maybe they are best left to both the Parks Board, park staff, as well as City Council, so that they don't become popularity contests. One of the concerns was made, what about a little neighborhood park in somebody's district where the city said, yeah, we should turn that into public housing or something? Well, wait a minute, you know, that vote might happen that way if somebody had enough money to convince people, yeah, we need public housing there. At the same time, what about those neighbors around that little neighborhood park who say, wait a minute, this is our park? I would much rather have our park advisory board make that call, park staff, as well as City Council that has to listen to the public who are really interested than just people voting, whether they know about it or not. You know, look at it right now. We have some really tough questions for people, Gallagher, Tabor, and I would hope people research these thoroughly and make the best possible decision. But on the chance they won't, parkland is just too important to turn into a popularity contest.
And Ken, I mean, will voters have all the information? This comes from a question from one of our listeners. Is there information the voters need to make a decision that is not available to them? Appraisals, anything else that may be confidential in one sense, or is everything out there for the voters to gather to make an informed decision?
That's a good question. And it's interesting because I think if the city had to make its case to the voters, that they would have to put things out there. And I'd have to go back to the most recent example we had with Strawberry Fields, where we actually, a successor group to our current Protect Our Parks group, literally had to sue the city to get them to release the appraisals. And the city would not even release the appraisals to the city council, let alone the Parks Board. And the day before the suit was to go to court, the city suddenly decided, oh yes, we can release the appraisals. So I think there's a good reason to distrust the current process. And I think that if the city has to make its case to the voters, you have a chance of much greater openness. And for instance, on Strawberry Fields, there was some polling done at the time, and overwhelmingly, at least according to the polls, a majority of voters were opposed to this land exchange. But it was very much negotiated behind closed doors, I must say that. And it was presented as a fait accompli, really, to the Parks Board. And I've been on the Parks Board. I did 2 full terms. And I think sometimes, the Parks Board, sadly, is treated almost as a rubber stamp. And I have great respect for the people there, but there is, I can tell you, a huge degree of pressure put on the Parks Board. And in point of fact, on the vote for Strawberry Field, or that land exchange, and this was something totally unique, never happened in my experience, the mayor personally called each Parks Board member and lobbied that person extensively before the vote, the day before the vote. And I think this is one of the things that we fear is political pressure, not only on the Parks Board, but also on city council members. And this is why we think that ultimately, let it go back to the people who own the properties, who own these parklands. And I would note, in all the research we did, we could only find 2 examples in Colorado in the last 50 plus years where a parkland exchange was put before the voters. One was in Denver, I think the other one was in Longmont. And Denver was a bit like the example that Susan was talking about. It was a park that was in a rather depressed part of the city. A lot of problems in it, and the city decided to see if we could sell it off, and they put it to the voters, and the voters voted it down, even after the approval of the Parks Board and the City Council. And today that park, Vanderbilt Park, the voters have got it right, because that part of Denver was massively redeveloped, and that park is now a crown jewel in an area. And it was even interesting to find that recently the city bought land to enlarge that particular park that 20, 30 years before they'd wanted to sell off.
Susan, do you have any comment? You've been involved with the process for so long, and I'd like to get your thoughts kind of on information available to the public, kind of the process of that. Is it good enough for voter approval, or what are your views?
Well, I guess my concern is, we muzzle our park staff, any staff member. Once there's something actually put on the ballot, then the park staff or any kind of city staff or any kind of county staff, if it's a county issue, can no longer comment on it. It's against the law. So now you're relying on the mayor, on the elected officials, members of city council, and then you're relying on advocacy groups like mine and, you know, groups like CONO to put forth a point of view for people to get the information. And yet the people with the facts, with a lot of the nitty gritty information, are not allowed to talk about it anymore. I mean, so it's challenging, and I do worry about that, because my organization doesn't have the capacity, if these come up regularly, to stand up and say, I mean, we will certainly always stand up and say, this is what we think and why, but to actually, actually actively run a campaign. Campaigns cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, you know, so there's no way that we would have the ability or the capacity to do anything like that. So then you're sort of left with whoever has the bigger budget to put it forth to the voters, to put something on the airwaves, to send flyers out, which may or may not be accurate. I don't know. In some ways, there's a little less accountability with that process than I have seen working with the Parks Advisory Board and with City Council. You know, for all its failings, the Strawberry Fields process had some amazing number of public hearings where people had a chance to express their point of view. The Parks Board itself brought that up no fewer than 2 or maybe 3 times, and it took hours and hours of public testimony and Parks Board members speaking out on it and questioning. And I mean, it was an exhaustive process where very thoughtful people tried to bring the best information and make the best possible decision. And Kenton, of course, and I, of course, disagree on what happened at the end. But our organization felt it all in all, it was a very good public process, no matter the outcome. I wonder how far we're going to take this whole public voting thing. You know, we vote on Tabor. I don't know how you all feel about that, but I certainly have some views on the value of people always voting themselves tax increases, but that's a whole different subject. You know, every time we annex another piece to the city, should we be asking the people to vote on that? I mean, there are a number of things that arguably you could always go to a vote of the people, but then it begs the question, why do we elect city council members? Why do we have staffs? Why do we, have some of these boards? So I go back on that. I think the best possible information is contained in the way we do it at this time, and could do it with a supermajority.
Yeah, Ken, I mean, supermajority is a high bar. And I guess I'm still asking the question, why isn't that good enough?
It's not good enough for several reasons. And one, I'd go back to the basic premise that parkland belongs to the citizens, and that is the standard practice throughout most of the rest of Colorado. But beyond that, I'm sure you have, and I know Susan sat through hours and hours of city council meetings, and I can't tell you how many 8-1 decisions I've seen. And I just worry, and you could even say that the present council would not do something crazy, but we've had vast changes in the makeup of our city council. There are some groupings that I'd probably like better than others, but the problem with the supermajority is that it leaves it in the hands not only of the politicians, but the specific politicians who were there at that particular moment in time. And, I'd go back to the Board of County Commissioners in 2008, talking actively about selling parkland. The thing is that if you even with the supermajority, you're still leaving it in the hands of the politicians. And we have a system. Susan said we could all talk about Tabor, but we have a system here right now where I don't think our councils are particularly representative, because these poor people are paid $6,000 a year, and you've either got to be retired or very wealthy to be on the council. And so I do have some really serious concerns about how representative a council made up of people who essentially have to volunteer. Yes, they have to be elected, But I'm not sure that the council, as it's structured here in Colorado Springs today, is particularly representative. And the other reason for staying with the voters is, and I would quote a city official we talked to in one of the neighboring cities. His basic comment was, why do we believe we should leave it to the voters and not have the politicians and the bureaucrats do it? And he said, well, the main reason is it keeps us from doing stupid stuff. And I think that was very true. And I'd go back to the point I made a few minutes ago that when you have something like 2B, Protect Our Parks, you're not going to have very many elections. And one of the things that I think we need to bring out, and it's interesting that Susan did talk about extending TOPS, we have other mechanisms to accomplish these goals. And this would have been the argument we would have made. In fact, several of us, now Council President Richard Scorman and I, submitted applications to the TOPS Working Committee. If you really wanted these properties that the Broadmoor was offering, buy them with TOPS. The money was there, it could have been done. The bottom line is I don't think the city actually wanted them badly enough to do that.
Great, well, thanks. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here, and Shane, either of you, Susan, why don't we start with you? Kind of explain to us what role the Parks Advisory Board plays in the sale of parkland, and this is to both of you, will this be affected, will that role be affected in any way by these measures?
Sure, and certainly Ken can speak to that too, as he served as president of the Parks Advisory Board. I think that it's telling that the Park Advisory Board was asked which they preferred, whether it would go to a vote of the people or whether it would be decided by the supermajority. And they voted that it go to the supermajority, which I think speaks to their level of trust for park staff, as their level of trust for their own decision-making ability. And truly, I have watched it time and time again where city council says publicly, well, the Park Advisory Board recommends a vote like this. And it certainly seems at this point in time, and all the meetings that I have ever attended, it seems to be an important piece to their decision-making process. So I think there's a reason that the Park Advisory Board feels that the supermajority is the preferred way to go. And I think that they feel like if you're going to take these land exchanges and just put them out to a vote of the people who may or may not consider these carefully, what are we doing? What's the point? Why are we spending dozens of hours deliberating over these very complicated and multifaceted decisions? And so I think there was some very strong feelings and some well-written essays from some past members of Parks Advisory Boards, encouraging the parks, encouraging city council to support the supermajority and not the popular vote. So these issues, if a developer comes to a park staff and says, hey, if you'll give me this, I would consider giving you this. We have been assured, and we've seen this time and time again, any kind of exchange is usually, we get 4 acres, they get 2. There was a recent one where the Garden of the Gods trading post wanted a piece of property, and it means that the Garden of the Gods park is going to get more needed parking. So it was a very easy trade, and Parks Board looked at it. They made sure that the conservation values of the park weren't really going to be impacted, that the user experience wasn't going to be impacted, and if anything, it's going to be improved because now we're going to have more parking, and so that went through the normal process like it would before Parks Board. Parks Board is the deciding board in that case, and then again it goes up to City Council, who usually often rubber stamps what the Parks Advisory Board will recommend in those cases. Now, should something like that have gone to a vote of the people, and I don't remember the exact acreage, but I think it would have risen to that threshold, and it might have required a vote of the people. Okay, we don't have a vote coming up until April. So would that be the kind of thing we should have a $350,000 special election? Or we could put it in the county vote right now that comes up in November. But every time the city puts something on the county ballot, they have to pay money for the number of initiatives that they have on that ballot. So it would have cost more for the taxpayer to put that on the ballot. But it would, I think, it would have risen to that threshold and have to be voted on. You know, I think that we can trust our park advisory board and our city council to make those decisions, but we all have the opportunity in that case to attend the park advisory board and be heard, and then go before city council and be heard.
Kent, you want to respond?
Could I comment on that? Because I think, with all due respect, Susan, you do have that one wrong on the Garden of the Gods exchange. And it was sort of Exhibit A when we were negotiating with the city on the parameters that would be included in 2B. And that exchange would fall within the de minimis. It would not require an election. The city is actually going ahead with it. And it just would not have been a problem because it fell within the very carefully negotiated exceptions to exchanges that would require a vote of the people. It was too small. And I do want to pick up on one other thing that Susan says, because it's been repeated, I think, a few too many times about the cost of elections. Yes, if you have a absolutely special election, it can cost up to $350,000. But for instance, we would not have advocated putting 2B on this November's ballot if it had been the only city item. Because if the city has another item on the November ballot, then adding other city items does not result in extra costs. There is an initial cost. But we deliberately held back, and we talked very closely with city council members and decided we would not go ahead with 2B. And I don't think 2C would be there if there wasn't 2B, which is another whole question. And we only went ahead with 2B after the city had committed to putting 2A, which is the Tabor refund, which is greatly to the city's best interest to get passed. And so if you look at the history of our elections, this is another thing we went back and looked at. In almost all of the November elections, the city has something on the ballot already, whether it's, pothole tax, stormwater, Tabor issue. And if another issue is put on, say one that has to do with the land exchange, there is not an extra cost. And beyond that, and the thing that, going back to my experience on the Parks Board, everybody talks about being fast and being nimble, but all the land exchanges that I was either involved in as a participant on the TOPS committee or the Parks Board literally took years to negotiate. And I think even the Garden of the Gods Visitor Center was a project that took several years to come to fruition. So I think the idea that we have to have special elections that are going to be costly to the taxpayer is something of a red herring.
Susan, can you respond to that for a couple of minutes, and we can move on to some audience questions?
Sure. So, again, we just don't know, Richard. We just don't know. We don't know what could be coming down the pike. And Kent, you may be absolutely accurate that this particular Garden of the Gods parking lot versus some parkland fell just underneath. But I think, what is it, 4 acres, 3 acres? I'm not sure what exactly the ballot language is. But what if something came along that was 6 acres? That obviously would rise above it, and then we would have to go to a public vote. I mean, it's a fairly low bar as far as what would be voted on and what would not. We have the list of parks. It's not inclusive. In fact, there's a couple of kind of important parks that are not on that list when people vote. Jimmy Camp Creek Park is not on that list. And also Dorchester Park is not on that list, which is kind of interesting. And it may be something that my organization is going to have to advocate for down the road if there are plans to do some things to those parks that that cancer organization is okay with, but maybe others are not. We'll all have to see that. But I think, you know, I do think the cost of the election is not as big a deal. I think he's right about that it's probably true that we can go ahead and you know, wait every other April. On the other hand, we don't know what we don't know. And I know that we have a park staff that works very hard to deal with these complex issues and then bring them to the Parks Board to improve the system as a whole. I mean, that's certainly what we just saw with the latest TOPS purchase, which again was very controversial with you know, some of the pieces that were purchased. But if you watch that process, at the end of the day, I think you'd have to argue it was a very good process. And I'm talking about the quarry property, which is going to mean that we're going to eventually have a parking lot for the Waldo Canyon area. But you know, to ask people to read these definitions and these explanations and then vote on it. Gosh, I would love to live in a city where we could expect everybody to do their homework and put in their time, and we would get great information, but we don't know. We don't know if we will get that.
I'd like to throw up another question to you both. An audience member asks, with the population growth in Colorado Springs, it seems conceivable that the number of city council representatives could be increased in the future. Does the 2C proposal, which requires, well, both proposals requiring 7 of 9 members to approve, would that be addressed in any future council expansion?
Well, I think we're both going to have to speculate here. I think even before you increase the number of city council members, you're going to have to start paying them, and certainly paying a close to a living salary before you even talk about adding more people. But the other thing, and I'm sure you probably have to get the city attorney in here, if you change the size of the council, I think there's going to be all sorts of language in the city charter that would have to be changed accordingly. You know, it's like when we made the shift to the strong mayor system a few years ago, all sorts of provisions in the charter had to be changed to accommodate the new structure under the strong mayor. And I'm sure that this would be just one of the bits of tweaking. You know, the logical thing, say, would be if you increase the council by, say, a couple more members, you might have to up by at least 1 more on the supermajority, both under 2B and 2C. But I'm truly speculating here.
I mean, the language is pretty specific about a supermajority, so I think I agree with Kent. Probably they would, whatever the new numbers are, a supermajority would be required, and it may require further, you know, decision making of some sort. But certainly the essence of that for either 2B or 2C is that it'd be a very high bar indeed before we go ahead and go forward with some kind of a parkland exchange.
And another question, when parkland is traded, are both trades or both subjects of the trading equal in value? Are parkland trades with other land apples to apples?
I'm happy to have Susan chime in, but I think this is one of the problems. And what I would say, and I'd go back to, you know, one of the basic points that, you know, I hope your audience gets, that one of the things that happens when you have something like 2B and you say it's going to go to the voters is essentially that you don't have elections and exchanges. This has been the case in the rest of the state. As I say, Denver had 1 that went to an election, Longmont had 1. And what happens is the city finds other ways to do this, and they have tops, and it's actually much more straightforward because you're simply going out and buying or trying to buy what you want, as opposed to trading away something that you already have to gain that. And I would still argue that that was the best way to to have proceeded with the Strawberry Fields land exchange. That if we really wanted some of those other properties, we should have talked to the Broadmoor and bought them. And I think that I'd go back to the comment a few minutes ago that having something like 2B basically keeps the city from doing stupid stuff. And I would note, just on the Strawberry Exchange, there was a lot of controversy over the appraisals. The Broadmoor was allowed to appraise its properties. The city's appraisals were, we thought, notoriously low, and so much so that the city appraiser was later censured by the real estate appraisals board for those appraisals.
Susan, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I would just encourage anybody to go out to Strawberry Fields today. I wish that they had gone out before any of this took place and hiked some of those trails and looked at the property. And it certainly was charming, I won't deny that, but it was a fairly neglected piece of land used primarily by the people that lived near there. Had a lot of very poor trails, social trails, a lot of problems with erosion, a lot of trash in that area, and it was partly because, as I started my comments, we have a fairly unresourced, under-resourced park system. What we pay today, what the general fund support for parks today, is still less than what it was in 2006. And yet we all know that labor costs more, material costs more, and yet our general fund support for parks is still lower than it was back in 2006. So we have forced our park staff and our Parks Advisory Board to be extremely creative when it comes to taking care of property. And when this opportunity came along to do this exchange and as I mentioned before, to add to a critical trail, the Chamberlain Trail, that has been part of the master plan and that will one day run from Blodgett Peak all the way to Cheyenne Mountain State Park, but had some critical gaps that this trade addressed, plus took Strawberry Fields. The Broadmoor built trails, maintains trails, public trails, everyone can use for perpetuity. It will never be developed, and only created a 7-acre thumbprint for some purposes that they haven't even fulfilled yet. I mean, my organization, as I said, really struggled with this, because truly, if you start from a place where you never, ever, ever exchange or trade parkland, that's a philosophical place that I can respect. But being pragmatic, the need to be pragmatic, especially in the city with its needs, we think that was an amazing deal. We think it still is an amazing deal. Kent and I are just going to have to agree to disagree. If that had gone to a vote of the people, his polling shows it would have failed. We would not own that portion of the bar, that portion of the incline, those various trail easements for Chamberlain Trail. I think we would be a poorer city today if that deal had not gone through. So we have to politely agree to disagree on that.
We do. I would have to note that actually we didn't get the bar trail, because the bar trail was actually at the same time the Broadmoor was trading the land to the city around the bar trail. It was trading the trail itself to the Forest Service as part of their Craig's land deal, so that they could acquire the Forest Service land that includes Emerald Valley Ranch. I mean, this is one of the great ironies, is we got the land, but we didn't actually get the trail. And I also would argue that on both the bar trail and the incline, there were existing agreements that would have allowed them to be used regardless of who owned land. And I think there is a slight irony, as I totally agree with Susan, that the Parks Department is underfunded. I think it's an embarrassment in this city. But what did we do? Because we were underfunded, we actually acquired double the acreage of land that we can't, we say we don't have enough money to maintain Strawberry Fields, so we get almost double the acreage in the land exchange. of land that we also can't afford to maintain. So I'm
Well,
not,
fortunately, we haven't messed up that land yet, like we did Strawberry Field. So, and the fact is, open space like what we purchased or what we received, as you well know, Kent, that open space is so much cheaper to maintain than a parkland per se. But we could go on and argue
it
some of these
could,
things.
and, I would argue that Strawberry Fields was as much open space as it was parkland.
And pretty damaged open space too at the time. But
It seems like these measures are in response in large part to Strawberry Fields.
oh, there's no doubt.
If Strawberry Fields didn't occur, would these propositions be on the ballot?
I think probably not, but I would go back to some of the points I made in the beginning, that Strawberry Fields happened, and when we began to look at the situation in the rest of the state, what we found was that in the rest of the state, something like 90% of the municipalities, if you'd had a Strawberry Fields there, it would have had to go to a vote of the people. And this is why we came forward. And as Susan knows, we've been working on this with several city councils even before the present initiative. We almost made it onto the ballot last year, and we just think that Colorado Springs would be better off being in step with the rest of the state. And it's not just the rest of the state. I would submit, and we obviously haven't covered the whole country, but a number of states have the same provisions that Colorado does. That is that parkland is special, it's unique, you can't replace it, and therefore, if you get into a situation where, particularly where you're talking about exchanging or selling it, you really have to go back to the people who own it. And the people who own it are the citizens who are the voters.
And I would counter that, Richard, and say this. We have never passed something like this because we haven't needed to pass something like this. We have had, I think, a stellar park staff as well as a very passionate citizenry that speaks out regularly and often about parkland and trails. And for the most part, what we have done as a city has been amazing in terms of expansion and buying the right land and producing the number of the miles of trails that we have. We aren't like some of the cities around the country where truly they are looking at turning parkland into a mall or something that has no public per se outdoor value, but it's strictly driven by developer interests. That has not been the case here from my experience and from my reading. And so the reason we haven't had a rule like that or a law is because truly we haven't needed. Now Bear Creek would have been a travesty, but people rose out of their skin and people actually formed a friends group and raised the money and put a conservation easement on Bear Creek Regional Park to make sure that county leaders never ever considered doing that to Bear Creek Park. So the public spoke loudly, and something came out of it that was very good. But I don't know that it required a vote of the people. I think there's a good reason that right now we have most of the organizations in town, from the Chamber, Visit COS, today the Downtown Partnership supported it. We have a number of organizations that have said, yes, there should be a very high bar when we exchange land, but we think the supermajority is the most prudent way to go.
Could I just add one follow on to Susan's? There are a number of organizations who are also supporting 2B. The Sierra Club is supporting 2B. The League of Women Voters is supporting 2B. The Aiken Audubon Society is supporting 2B, and we expect there are going to be some more endorsements. I have great respect for the organizations that Susan's had mentioned, but they are essentially the political establishment here in Colorado Springs. And I think the political establishment doesn't want 2B and does want 2C. And I would say that for the people, the owners of our parks, 2B is the way to go. And I don't think it's going to result in chaos or excessive elections or anything. I think it's just a sensible safeguard for one of the most important and most irreplaceable resources that we have as a community.
Well, thank you both. We're drawing to the end of our hour together. You both kind of made closing statements just now. But I'm going to ask Susan, do you have any last thoughts you'd like to leave with everyone? And then Kent, I'll ask you the same question.
So we would encourage people, and this is truly straight from my board of directors and staff, we would encourage people to consider these two questions very carefully. And we would encourage people to vote yes for both, yes for one. But what they should not do is vote yes for one and no for the other. They should abstain from the other. Because the fear is that if people vote yes for one and no for the other, and some people out there are just going to vote no, no, that we may not pass either one of these. And we really do think there should be a very high bar when it comes to exchanging or selling parkland. You know, even though we know that all of our TOPS properties will be protected for perpetuity, and we do a very good job generally of protecting our parkland, this is an extra step. This is a good thing. So again, we would ask people to consider it carefully, vote yes for both, yes for one, but just abstain from the other and don't vote no. Does that make sense to you, Richard?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Can I add one caveat? Because there's one part of this equation that we actually should have discussed right at the beginning. And that is, if you look at that convoluted legalese in the ballot language, both 2B and 2C can pass, but only one of them will actually become the new language in the charter. That is the way it's set up. If both of them get over 50% of the votes cast, it's only going to be the one that gets the most votes.
Oh, of course.
Actually becomes the new rules of the game in the city charter. And so our message to people is do your homework, do your research, check out your values. What do you think is important? And we hope it's going to be 2B. And we would urge people to vote yes for 2B. We would not urge people to vote yes on both. Either abstain on 2C or vote no if you feel strongly.
Thanks for that clarification. And thank you both for being here tonight. This is, both these measures are very important, and I'm glad that you both came to shed light on them. So we're going to be holding other CONO ballot issue forums, and you'll see that on your screen. I'm not going to go over them each, but please go to cscono.org/webcasts for more details, and you can pick up the Zoom webinar links at that place. So again, Susan, Kent, thank you very much. Thank you for all the attendees and questioners. We appreciate it. Have a great night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to CONO.